final stage in the deployment pipeline is the production environment, where something is actually placed in production and users are allowed to access it. And this is, as you might expect, at the end. However, just saying you're placing it in production is not the end of the story. There are partial deployment strategies where you only deploy part of it. There's something called live testing, there's rollback, there's monitoring after it gets into production. So partial deployment strategies, there are two of these. There's canary testing, which is a technique for allowing a limited number of users to access the real system. It's the modern version of beta test, and it's performed for for system correctness and quality purposes, especially things like performance and reliability. There's also something called A/B testing. That's a technique for assessing the viability of a new feature or modification. So some users would see one version of a system, others see another. There's a story from Google about what color blue should the query results be presented in, and there was an argument between two groups. One group wanted one color of blue, another one wanted another color of blue, and the manager said, okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to test and rely on data. And so they came up with 51 different shades of blue, and then chose the one that got the biggest number of click-throughs. The person that told me this story worked for Intuit, the tax people, and he said, well, he couldn't afford to do that kind of testing, so he just used the same shade of blue that Google used. But this is performed for marketing purposes. This is testing alternatives. And we'll get into when we talk about deployment, we'll get into these strategies in more detail. There's also something called live testing. So Netflix, for example, has what they call a simian army that performs testing after a system is in production. There's something called the chaos monkey, which kills production processes to make sure that the system is reliable. So you're watching a video, and some bot will kill the process presenting your video, and you should not notice the difference. And so that's what the chaos monkey does. There's a latency monkey, which does the same thing, except instead of killing production processes, it introduces extra latency. Again, you should not notice the difference as a user. There are other kinds of monkeys that come around, part of their simian army, that perform various janitor services. They look for certificates or licenses about to expire. They make sure that the localization is appropriate. Now that Netflix is global, things show up in different languages and different colors, and there's a lot of sensitivity in various places about choice of colors and so on and so forth. They clean up unused resources, and they ensure that their security rules with application to security groups are appropriately used. Sometimes things go bad after you've gone into production. There may be a functional error not caught during testing. There may be a performance or reliability or security problem that shows up. And you have two options. You can roll back, or you can, which means returning to a prior version. And this may cause problems if the database schema is modified. Or you could roll forward, which means fixing the error and deploying a new version. This requires the ability to deploy quickly. And again, when we talk about deployment in more depth, we'll get into these techniques in more detail. Once the system is placed into production, it's monitored. So a portion of the production infrastructure is monitoring and alerting about applications. So there's a measuring system that observes the execution of your application in a variety of ways, and it informs the operators of potential problems. Again, we'll get into this in more detail later. So the best practice is to replace production executables periodically. Why? Because that ensures that patches are always, that the systems in production always have the latest patches. Otherwise, you have to manually patch all the systems in production. Management of credentials is a problem. Again, we'll talk more about that and how to do that later, but that's critical for security. The geographic location that you store data is constrained by various laws. The European Union says personal data cannot go outside the European Union. So if you're somebody like Amazon that just sort of backs things up to different regions, you have to be sensitive to what data gets backed up where. And testing during production is becoming more common, and that's certainly a good way of finding out errors and problems. So to summarize, the production environment is in production. It's open for users to access the system. The testing is never done. The things like live testing and monitoring mean that tests goes on all the time. There are concept of partial deployments, both for development and marketers, and you have to allow for rollback if the deployment causes problems.